I'm joined today by Laura Reiley, who's a food critic who has been exposing and investigating food fraud in Florida, including most recently about so-called farm-to-table restaurants. Now, Laura, our TV audience will notice right away that we're blurring your face, which you've asked us to do. Is this, I know food critics who generally want to be sort of anonymous so that restaurants don't know when they go into a restaurant. Is that why we're blurring your face, or is it specific
Absolutely.
to
It's
this?
not it's not because I have a face for radio, okay?
Is it because of that, or because of something specific to this investigation we're going to talk about?
Oh, nothing about this. Just ongoing. I mean, I've been a restaurant critic for about 25 years, and it's much easier to do your job if no one knows what you look like.
Fair enough.
So, an unfortunate part of the job, but there it is.
So let's start with farm to table. Farm to table is a concept that's increasingly popular. What do restaurants mean when they say they are a farm to table restaurant?
I think the shortest answer it means that they're sourcing locally. So they're working with local farms. And the word local itself is incredibly problematic because there's no legal definition and everyone means something different by it. That can mean within state boundaries or within a day's drive or within 400 or 800 miles. I mean, it really is a very wishy-washy term.
And there's another caveat usually, right, which is whenever possible with the products where this
Sure.
is realistically possible. So it strikes me sort of as like the all natural term, which is a very little value in really figuring out what it is we're being promised or given, isn't it?
Yeah, I think with all these terms, sustainable, natural, responsibly raised, none of these have any kind of real teeth. There's no legal definition for any of it. There is for certified organic, but that's about the only term that has real, a real meaning. And because of that, it's a slippery slope. I mean, the average restaurant works with about 300 ingredients. And so how many of those ingredients have to be local for you to be able to make the claim that you're a farm to table restaurant?
Okay, so talk to us about sort of the logistics of your investigation, however you want to sort of introduce the audience to what it is you started looking into and how. I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So I've noticed in recent years, as a restaurant critic, I've always known that there are fibs that restaurants tell. You ask, oh, do you make your desserts in-house? And they say, oh, yes, everything's made in-house. And you know that that dessert came off the back of a Cisco truck. I mean, that's a fairly common thing. But I noticed maybe 3 years ago here in the Tampa Bay area, and this happened sooner in other markets, but you started to see that creep of, it's almost like arms escalation. We source local whenever possible with farm names on the chalkboard and on menu items. Heirloom tomatoes from Farmer Brown or pasture raised pork or all these things. And about maybe 2 years ago, I started wondering, well, how often is it correct? And I also do a lot of agricultural writing in the state of Florida. And I noticed more and more that farmers were grousing about essentially being used as billboards, that they would sell their pasture raised pork to a restaurant, to the kind of the latest celebrity chef restaurant 3 or 4 times, get on the chalkboard, then the restaurant would stop buying from them and that name would never come off the chalkboard. And the small farmers, they don't really have any recourse. I mean, they don't want to be crabby with these restaurants. They don't want to complain. They want to stay in the good graces of the high-end restaurants. And they certainly want the publicity with the public to have those items on the menu or on a chalkboard. But they're losing out in two ways if a restaurant is misrepresenting, if they're buying commodity pork and pawning it off as Farmer Brown's. Obviously that's money that's not in Farmer Brown's pocket, but then it also is muddying his brand. You go there and you eat that $40 pork chop and you say to yourself, huh, it's not, I don't know if that's worth $40 when in fact you've just eaten a commodity, $6 pork chop.
And talk to us about sort of the procedural of how you did this. I mean, if I were doing this and I didn't, I would imagine I go to the restaurant, I see what farms are being mentioned, then I go and I actually talk to the people at those farms. And then if they tell me, actually they haven't bought, that restaurant hasn't purchased from us for months, maybe I'd go back to the restaurant and sort of ask them about it and see if there's some kind of explanation. How did you work this?
You would be a great investigator. That's exactly what I did. So I would go to a restaurant, eat a meal, steal a menu, photograph the chalkboards, and then just start making phone calls. And in some cases, it was driving out to the farms or the cheese producers or whatever, because they don't want to be whistleblowers. So they were a little bit, there was a lot of let's go off the record. So it took some wrangling to get some of these small farmers to say, yes, I'm willing to say that I have not sold to that restaurant in 3 or 4 months.
Were there
So
cases though where there was not even any instance of purchase? In other words, you described, well, they may have purchased the eggs from this place for a month, but then they stopped or whatever. Were there times where you would go to a farmer or a grower or whatever, and they'd say, oh no, I've never sold anything to that restaurant?
yes, it was on a continuum from honest mistakes to wholesale fabrication, and there was a lot more of that than I anticipated.
Wow.
There was one restaurant here where they have a big, beautiful chalkboard outside, in the parking lot, basically. So, you go to the valet, you give them your keys, and you look at the chalkboard and you say, wow, all these farmers, this is amazing. Well, I started calling, and for instance, there was a fisherman listed who was supposedly selling them snapper and grouper. So I called him and I said, I'm doing a sourcing story. I want to talk to you about your relationship with Boca. And this angler said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't even know what a boca is. So I said, oh, well, you're on their chalkboard as providing snapper and grouper. And the guy said, I'm not legally allowed to sell direct to restaurants. And B, I don't even catch snapper and grouper. So there's some really interesting misrepresentation going on. And some of it does seem kind of outright lying.
So talk to us now about the reaction from some of the restaurants that you called out. We're going to link to your tampabay.com article about this. What have been the repercussions from what you've written?
Well, no one likes to be called out, so I'm sure I'm not the most popular girl in the Tampa Bay area right now. But pretty much all of the restaurants that I called, their response was kind of like, well, yeah, you're right. We need to change the chalkboard, or we haven't updated the menu, or yeah, that's a problem.
Sort
Or
of like
yes, we
clerical
recognize.
errors.
Kind of. I mean, there were some where they recognized that they had been caught in a lie. For example, there's a restaurant called Pelagio. It's actually a very good restaurant. A lot of these restaurants are exceptional restaurants. And I actually think the chef at Pelagio does a lot of great work. But they had Florida blue crab on the menu for a long, long time. And in fact, we had it DNA tested, and it was swimming blue crab, kind of a lesser species that's from the Indian Ocean. So completely wrong side of planet Earth for that representation there. And he said immediately, okay, I'm changing the menu right now. And that's what a lot of them did. There are also some interesting upshots from this. For instance, that restaurant Boca that I mentioned, they hired a liaison person, kind of a forager person, to negotiate between the restaurant and the farmers, and then also to act as a kind of the person who gives transparency to the public. So there's like an insert in the menus now that gives full transparency about the provenance of the food, and this guy's responsibility is precisely that. So I think there could be some very good things that come of it.
So that gets me sort of into my next question, which is we've talked about fish fraud on the program, which is you go to a restaurant, you think you're getting fish A, it's actually fish B. Rarely does it work in the consumer's favor in that case, right? But in some of the reports I've read, the restaurant doesn't actually know that they're serving something different from what they claim to serve. In other words, they've been deceived or misinformed, as the case may be, by the supplier, the middle person in the chain. Did you
I
consider
agree.
that possibility in your investigation for some of these cases?
I spoke to a number of restaurateurs who said that happens quite frequently, and that, for instance, a gentleman who owns a series of fish restaurants in this area said, "Well, I got a good source for Nantucket scallops, and I bought a couple gallons of them. I used them. They seemed a little funny, and I read the fine print, and it said Nantucket style scallops from China." So I think that is a very frequent occurrence, that the delivery person either is pulling a bait and switch, or they don't know themselves. I mean, the whole supply chain, fish is difficult because, it doesn't come with a barcode. It's not possible to look at a white, fillet of fish and say, oh, it's clearly not grouper, it's bassa, for instance. And I think a lot of reputable restaurateurs, for this reason, choose to buy their fish whole because it's much easier to tell species with a whole fish where you see
Hmm.
its scales, its fin structure, etc. So I think that there are some ways to be a little smarter in your purchasing.
Hey, in the last bit of time we have, how do you get blue crab DNA tested? I mean, do you pull out a microscope and petri dish at the restaurant, or do you sort of like stuff it into your purse and then hand it off to a scientist? How does that happen?
I did. I spent a lot of time stuffing baggies of fish into my handbag, so I'm still waiting for the paper to buy me a new one. It's a little fishy in there. But yeah, anytime I saw a fish representation that seemed a little sketchy to me, I would tuck things away. And often in a sushi restaurant, you get a sushi roll that they say, "Oh yeah, it's grouper," and you look and you think, that looks like tilapia or tastes like tilapia to me. So I went to the University of South Florida marine biology people, and they basically sent the specimens away
Right.
to a DNA lab, and they get basically some coding back, and then they have to match the coding with species. And there were a number of times where we found misrepresentations that way.
All right, Laura Reiley, food critic, exposing food fraud. Thanks so much for sharing this with us. Really great work.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.